There is a painting in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. That stops people cold. Not because it is beautiful, although it is. Not because it is technically astonishing, although it is that too. But because when you stand in front of it, you feel something happening to the air between you and the canvas. Something that has no name in the vocabulary of art criticism. Something that feels less like looking at a painting and more like making contact with a mind that was here and is somehow still here in the swirling, impossible night sky above a sleeping village in Provence. The Starry Night. Painted in June 1889 inside the Saint-Paul de Moselle Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where Vincent van Gogh had committed himself voluntarily, 1 month after cutting off part of his own ear. He was 36 years old. He had been painting seriously for less than a decade. He had sold exactly 1 painting in his lifetime, and he would be dead in 14 months. The painting that everyone in the world knows was made by a man the world had already decided to discard. That is not the tragedy. The tragedy is that Vincent knew it. This is Art and Ashes. Tonight we are going to Zundert in the Netherlands in 1853, and then to London, and then to the coal mines of Belgium, and then to Paris, and then to Arles, and then to an asylum on a hill in Provence, and finally to a wheat field in Auvers-sur-Oise, where a man walked out one July afternoon in 1890 and did not come back. We are going to talk about what he made. We are going to talk about what it cost him. We are going to talk about his brother, who was perhaps the most important person in the history of Western art, that almost no one outside art history has ever properly thanked. We are going to talk about the loneliness, and the letters, and the color yellow, and what it means to make beautiful things out of a life that was, by almost any conventional measure, a failure. If you are new here, subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what Van Gogh painting has stayed with you. Every comment gets read, every single one. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in the village of Zundert in the southern Netherlands, in the province of North Brabant. He was the first surviving child of Theodorus van Gogh, a Dutch Reformed minister, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, the daughter of a bookbinder. The word "first surviving" matters here. Exactly 1 year before Vincent was born, on March 30th, 1852, Anna van Gogh had given birth to a stillborn son. That son had also been named Vincent Willem van Gogh. The grave was in the churchyard of Zundert, marked with a stone that bore his name, the name that was then given, a year later to the day, to the child who lived. Every Sunday on the way to church, the living Vincent van Gogh walked past the grave of the dead one, past a stone that bore his name, past the evidence that he had, in some sense, replaced someone, that he was the second version of something, the first version of which had not survived. Psychologists and biographers have written about this for 100 years, and we should be careful not to overinterpret it. Children carry all sorts of burdens they cannot name, and most of them do not become either geniuses or tragedies. But it is worth noting, without overstating, that the man who would spend his life searching for a sense of his own reality, his own rightness, his own right to occupy the space he occupied, began that life by walking weakly past the stone of his own name. The Brabant of Vincent's childhood was flat and Protestant and serious. His father's ministry was the center of the community's moral life. The family was respectable, educated, and connected. 3 of Theodorus's brothers were art dealers, which meant that the world of painting and commerce was not abstract to the Van Gogh family. It was practical. It was something men did for a living. It was a trade, like his father's trade. And like his father's trade, it was supposed to provide a stable livelihood for a stable man. The boy, who would be neither stable nor a dealer, showed early that he was different, not dramatically different, not the wild-eyed bohemian of the later mythology. Quiet, serious, solitary. He roamed the flat Brabant countryside for hours alone, collecting insects and stones, drawing the things he found with an attention that people around him found slightly unnerving. He made friends with difficulty. He found the company of other children confusing and sometimes painful. He was better with the landscape than with people, and the landscape was something he never stopped returning to, no matter what country he was in, no matter what was happening to him. His younger brother Theodorus, Theo, 4 years younger, born in 1857, was the person Vincent was closest to from childhood onward, and would remain the person he was closest to for the rest of his life. Their correspondence, which began formally in 1872, when Vincent was 19 and Theo was 15, and continued without significant interruption until Vincent's death in 1890, constitutes one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of art. More than 600 letters from Vincent to Theo survive, fewer from Theo to Vincent, because Vincent did not always keep them. But the letters that remain are not just biography. They are literature. They are a sustained act of self-examination and artistic theorizing that reads, even today, with a rawness that takes your breath away. In 1869, at the age of 16, Vincent went to work for Goupil and Compagnie, the international art dealing firm, for which his uncle Cent was a partner. He started in the Hague branch, selling prints and reproductions to the Dutch middle class. He was good at it, better than good. He had his mother's intelligence and his family's knowledge of art, and he threw himself into the work with the same intensity he brought to everything he ever did. His employers liked him. His colleagues found him a little intense. The customers, for the most part, bought what he recommended. In 1873, he was transferred to the London branch. He was 20 years old. He lived in Brixton, in a boarding house run by a widow named Ursula Lawyer, and he fell in love with Ursula's daughter, Eugenia. This is the first of the romantic catastrophes, and they follow a pattern that will repeat itself with painful consistency throughout Vincent's life. Intense attraction, complete emotional commitment, refusal, devastation. Eugenia Lawyer was already engaged. She told him so when he declared himself. Vincent, apparently, had not realized it. He had been reading it wrong. Her friendliness as interest, her warmth as something more than warmth. The rejection was not cruel. It was simply a fact. But Vincent did not take facts well when they contradicted what he needed to be true. He stopped eating. He withdrew from his colleagues. His work at Goupil deteriorated. He started reading the Bible obsessively, the beginning of a religious intensity that would consume him for the next several years. His family noticed the change and were alarmed. They moved him to the Paris branch, hoping the change would help. It didn't. In 1876, Goupil dismissed him. The official reason was attitude. He had become sullen, argumentative, unwilling to sell paintings he thought were bad to customers he thought didn't deserve the good ones. He had started, in short, behaving like an artist. in a world that had hired him as a salesman. He was 23 years old. His first career was over. He had no idea what came next. What came next was a years-long odyssey through various failed attempts to find a vocation that would hold him. He tried teaching in England. He tried bookselling in Dordrecht. He tried studying theology in Amsterdam, preparing for the ministry like his father. He failed the entrance requirements for the theology program and enrolled instead in a shortened course for lay preachers in Brussels. And then, in December 1878, he was sent as a lay minister to the Borinage, a coal mining district in southern Belgium that was among the most miserable places in Western Europe. The Borinage. Let that word sit for a moment. The coal miners of the Borinage lived and worked in conditions that were difficult to describe without sounding like you were exaggerating, but which contemporary accounts confirm were exactly as bad as they sound. Men and women and children descended into the earth before dawn and came up after dark. The shafts were dangerous and poorly ventilated. Explosions and cave-ins were common. The houses were cramped and damp. The pay was barely enough to eat. The children were pale and stunted. The men aged in a decade what other men aged in 4. Vincent threw himself into this world with a completeness that alarmed his superiors. He gave away his food. He gave away his clothes. He slept on the floor of a hut because the miners slept on floors, and he could not justify sleeping in a bed while they did not. He descended into the mines. He sat with the injured, and the dying, and the bereaved. He nursed a miner who had been badly burned in an explosion, with a selflessness that the man's family never forgot. His superiors in Brussels found this behavior embarrassing. A lay preacher was supposed to bring the gospel to the poor, not become one of them. Vincent's literalism, his insistence on actually living what the Gospels described, was impractical, undignified, and slightly unhinged. They dismissed him in 1879. He stayed in the Borinage anyway, without pay, without official status, without any clear sense of what he was doing there. He wandered the black landscape. He drew the miners. He drew their wives. He drew the machinery and the slag heaps and the hunched black figures, walking to and from the pit. He was 26 years old. He had failed at dealing, teaching, bookselling, theology, and preaching. He had no money, no prospects, and no idea what to do next. He was beginning to suspect that the answer might be drawing. The letter he wrote to Theo from the Borinage in the summer of 1880 is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of art. In it, after months of silence, after what he described as a period of wandering and despair, he tries to explain himself, to justify his existence, to account for the man he has become, to ask for understanding from the brother who had never stopped waiting for him to return. He uses the image of a man locked inside a cage. The man wants to come out, wants to do something, wants to be useful and alive, but the bars are there, and the man cannot always say why. He only knows that the cage is real, and that sitting still inside it is not the same as being free. And then Vincent van Gogh picked up a pen and started drawing. He was not a natural. This is important to say, because the myth of Van Gogh, the tortured genius burning with innate talent, obscures the reality of how he actually developed as an artist. He was not precocious. He did not produce astonishing juvenilia. His early drawings are clumsy, stiff, uncertain. the work of a man who wants desperately to draw, but has not yet discovered how. He worked at it with a determination that was almost violent. He copied prints by Millet and Daumier and Rembrandt for hours every day. He drew from life, peasants and workers and anyone who would sit still for him. He filled notebook after notebook with studies of hands, not faces, not grand compositions, hands. Because hands, he believed, told you everything about how a person had lived. A laborer's hands and a bourgeois' hands were different creatures. He wanted to draw the difference. He moved to The Hague in 1881 and began to study with his cousin by marriage, a painter named Anton Mauve, who was one of the leading figures of the Hague School. Mauve taught him to use watercolor and paint. He was generous and patient initially, but Vincent's personality, his refusal to follow instructions, his insistence on doing things his own way before he had mastered anyone else's way, strained the relationship. It always strained relationships. Vincent was the kind of person who inspired either deep devotion or complete exhaustion, and often both in the same person, over the course of a few months. In The Hague, he also became involved with a woman named Sian Horneck, Klasina Maria Horneck, a prostitute who was pregnant by another man when Vincent met her. She had a daughter. She was weathered by a life that had not been kind. She was not young. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. Vincent loved her, or believed he did. He brought her and her daughter and then her newborn son to live with him in his studio. He modeled her. He drew her constantly, pregnant, nursing, sitting, exhausted. The drawing he made of her hunched in a chair, titled Sorrow, which he considered one of his best early works, is an image of a specific woman at a specific moment in her life. That has the weight of something universal about it. Theo supported them all, financially, sending a monthly allowance that he could barely afford. His family were horrified. His father threatened to have him committed to a lunatic asylum. The relationship with Sian ended in 1883, under pressure from everyone around him, and from the simple fact that the arrangement was unsustainable, financially, emotionally, practically. Vincent left The Hague. He left Sian. He carried the guilt of both for years. He moved to Drenthe, a peat bog region of the northern Netherlands, where he hoped the landscape and the isolation would be productive. They were, briefly. Then the loneliness became unbearable, and he moved back to his parents' house in Nieuwenan. The Nieuwenan period, 1883 to 1885, is where the first recognizably great work appears, not in the sense of the mature Van Gogh, not the blazing color and kinetic brushwork of the later years, but in the sense of a painter who has found a subject and begun to understand how to render it honestly. The subject was the peasants of Brabant, the weavers who worked the hand looms, the farm laborers who planted and harvested the fields, the people who lived close to the earth, whose lives were organized around the rhythms of seasons and crops, whose faces and hands bore the evidence of their work in a way that Vincent found both honest and beautiful. He was influenced above all by Millet, the French painter who had spent his career depicting the peasant life of Barbizon, with a dignity that refused sentimentality. Vincent admired Millet with a devotion that bordered on worship. He carried Millet prints with him everywhere. He wrote about Millet in his letters as though discussing a saint, and he tried, in Nieuwenan, to do for the Brabant peasant what Millet had done for the peasant of Barbizon. The culmination of this effort was The Potato Eaters, finished in April 1885. It is a large, dark, ambitious painting, 5 figures around a table, sharing a plate of potatoes by lamplight, in a cramped and smoky interior. The palette is brown and black and ochre, the colors of earth, of shadow, of poverty. The figures are not beautiful. Their faces are rough and knobbly and specific, not types, but people. And the painting insists, with a stubbornness that is entirely Vincent's, that these people, in this moment, sharing food they grew with their own hands, are worthy of your full attention. He was immensely proud of it. He wrote to Theo that he wanted the picture to smell of bacon smoke and potato steam. He wanted people to feel, standing in front of it, that these were real hands that had been in the real earth, not elegant hands, not idealized hands, the hands of people who had worked. The painting was not well received. The critics who saw it, those who bothered to look at all, found it clumsy and ugly and technically deficient. Theo tried to sell it. He could not. Vincent's former mentor, Anton van Rappert, wrote him a brutal letter of criticism, dissecting everything that was technically wrong with it. The correspondence between them ended. Then his father died. March 1885. Theodorus van Gogh collapsed of a stroke in the doorway of his home and died before anyone could help him. He was 63 years old. He and Vincent had never fully understood each other. Their relationship had been one of mutual love and mutual incomprehension, of a father who wanted a conventional son, and a son who could not be conventional, and who could not explain why. Vincent did not paint a portrait of his father from life while he had the chance. He would regret this. He moved to Antwerp in late 1885, and then to Paris in March 1886. Paris changed everything. He arrived unannounced at Theo's apartment, sent a note from the Louvre telling his brother to come and collect him. Theo, who had been maintaining a small, comfortable apartment for himself, who had a social life and a career and a degree of equanimity that Vincent constantly disrupted, came and collected him. He always did. Paris in 1886 was the center of the artistic universe. Impressionism had exploded and fractured into post-impressionism. Monet was working, Degas was working, Renoir was working, and a generation of younger painters, Seurat, Signac, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec, Bernard, were pushing the inheritance of Impressionism in directions that no one could yet fully describe. It was a moment of extraordinary creative ferment, the kind that happens once in a generation, when everything seems possible and nothing is settled. Vincent arrived from the Dutch earth tones of Nuenen and was assaulted by color. The Impressionists had broken the grip of the Academy. The idea that painting had to model form in a specific way, had to represent light in a specific way, had to be composed according to rules that could be taught in schools. They had looked at the actual behavior of light in the actual world and found that it was not brown. It was blue and violet and pink and gold. It was broken and flickering and alive, and they had painted it that way, regardless of what the Academy thought. Vincent absorbed this lesson in about 2 years. He enrolled at the studio of Fernand Cormont. He studied Seurat's pointillist technique. He met Gauguin, with whom he would have one of the most consequential and catastrophic friendships in art history. He met Toulouse-Lautrec, who became a genuine friend. He painted 200 canvases. He drank too much. He fought with people. He was socially impossible in the close quarters of Paris's artistic community. Too intense, too needy, too unwilling to pretend that his opinions were anything less than convictions. And his palette transformed. The dark ochres and umbers of Nuenen gave way, steadily and then suddenly, to something that had no precedent: vermilion and emerald and cobalt blue, chrome yellow, that specific, ferocious, almost violent yellow. That would become the signature of everything he made afterward. He discovered that color was not decoration. Color was expression. Color was the thing itself, not the object's color, not the color as the eye registered it neutrally, but the color as it felt when a specific emotion was present. By February 1888, Paris had worn him down. The arguments, the social exhaustion, the cramped apartment shared with Theo, the gray northern winters. He needed light. He needed the South. He had been reading about Japan, about the clarity of Japanese painting, the intense color, the flatness, the way Japanese artists seemed to see the world as pure luminous surface. And he had decided that the south of France was the equivalent of Japan for a European painter, the place where the light was real, harsh, clarifying. He took a train to Arles. The 15 months that Vincent van Gogh spent in Arles, February 1888 to May 1889, represent one of the most extraordinary explosions of creative productivity in the history of Western art. He produced more than 200 paintings, more than 100 drawings. His letters from this period, to Theo, to his friend Émile Bernard, to Gauguin, read like dispatches from a man in the grip of a revelation so intense, it was nearly indistinguishable from madness. He had rented 4 rooms in a building on the Place Lamartine, the Yellow House, as he called it in his letters and paintings. He painted it, the exterior, with its butter yellow walls and blue shutters against a luminous sky. He decorated the inside. He bought furniture. He made his bedroom, a room in Arles, the subject of 2 extraordinary paintings, in which the simplicity of the space, the bed, the chair, the window, is rendered in a way that feels like a declaration of faith. This is my room. I live here. I am here. He painted the blooming fruit trees of Provence in the spring, almond trees, peach trees, pear trees, with a joy so unguarded it still communicates across 130 years. He painted the Rhone at night, the gas lamps reflected in the dark water, the stars above enormous and distinct, each one a separate presence in the sky, not a backdrop, but a character. He painted the café on the Place du Forum at night, the yellow light of the terrace pushing back against the blue of the night, the chairs and tables waiting. A painting about loneliness that does not feel lonely, about presence that is somehow also about absence. He painted the postman, Joseph Roulin, who became one of the few genuine friendships of Vincent's later life, a large, bearded, opinionated man who held fierce Republican political opinions and who would sit for Vincent with an equanimity that most people, exhausted by Vincent's intensity, could not maintain. Vincent painted Roulin 5 times. He painted Roulin's wife, Augustine, 4 times, seated in a chair, holding in her hand a rope that was attached, in reality, but not in the paintings, to a cradle rocking out of frame. He painted their baby. He painted the whole family. He wanted, desperately, the thing that the Roulins had, the domestic solidity, the accumulation of a life shared with other people, and he could get no closer to it than painting it. And the sunflowers. He painted them in preparation for Gauguin's arrival. He was decorating the Yellow House, specifically the room he had prepared for Paul Gauguin, who had agreed to come to Arles in the autumn of 1888 to form what Vincent imagined as the first studio of the South, a community of artists working together in the clear Provençal light, supporting and teaching each other, creating something new. He made 4 large canvases of sunflowers, cut flowers in vases, yellows ranging from pale lemon to deep orange gold, each flower individuated, in different stages of opening and wilting, each one its own presence, its own particular relationship to the light. They are not symbolic in the way people sometimes claim. They are not allegories of hope or death or transcendence. They are, with violent literalism, paintings of actual sunflowers in actual vases by a man who was capable of looking at flowers with the same intensity, other men reserved for God. Gauguin arrived in October 1888. He was, by any measure, a more worldly and more technically sophisticated painter than Vincent. Older, more traveled, more theoretical in his approach. He had opinions about everything. Vincent had opinions about everything. For 2 months, these 2 enormously strong wills inhabited the same 4 rooms. They argued constantly about technique. Gauguin painted from imagination and memory, Vincent from observation. Vincent thought painting from imagination was dishonest. Gauguin thought painting from observation was limited. They argued about art history, about religion, about the role of the artist in society, about money, about coffee. The arguments had the quality of 2 people who care enormously about the same things, but cannot agree on what those things mean or what to do with them. By December, the situation had become unsustainable. Gauguin was making plans to leave. Vincent knew it. The dream of the studio of the South was ending before it had properly begun. And Vincent, who had organized his entire emotional life around the arrival of Gauguin, who had painted the sunflowers for him, decorated the room for him, planned the future for him, was coming apart. On the evening of December 23, 1888, after an argument we cannot reconstruct fully, Vincent van Gogh cut off the lower portion of his left ear. With a razor, he wrapped it in paper. He walked to a brothel on the Rue de Récollet and gave it to a woman there, perhaps a woman he knew, perhaps a stranger. He walked home. He went to bed. He was found the next morning, unconscious from blood loss, by the police who had been called by the woman at the brothel. Gauguin had already left Arles before Vincent was found. He never returned. The story of the ear has been told 10,000 times, and most of those tellings have turned it into either Gothic spectacle or psychological pathology. What it actually was, what Vincent actually experienced in those hours, remains genuinely unknown. The episode was never fully described, not by Vincent, not by anyone who was there. He wrote about it to Theo afterward with a strange clinical detachment, as though describing something that had happened to someone else, or as though trying to understand it from the outside. What we know is that it was a crisis, the first in a series of crises. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital in Arles, then returned to the Yellow House, then was hospitalized again after the citizens of Arles petitioned the mayor to have him committed. They were afraid of him. His behavior in the weeks after the ear incident had convinced them that he was dangerous. Whether they were right is impossible to say. What is clear is that Vincent, faced with the choice between fighting the commitment and accepting it, chose to accept it. In May 1889, he voluntarily checked himself into the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. He was 36 years old. He brought his paints. Saint-Rémy, a former monastery on the slopes of the Alpilles, south of the Rhône. The patients were housed in converted monks' cells. The grounds were extensive. Gardens, olive groves, wheat fields. The view from certain windows took in the wheat fields and the hills beyond. The staff were not cruel. The regime was not punishing. It was simply a place apart from the world, governed by routines that were not his own, where he had no power over anything, except what he put on canvas. He painted through episodes, painting in the gardens and from his window and from memory. In the intervals between crises, he painted the olive trees, twisted, ancient, their leaves flickering silver and green in the mistral wind, with a technique that seems to capture not just the tree's appearance, but their movement, their rootedness, the particular quality of existing in the wind and not being moved by it. He painted the cypresses, dark, pointed, reaching upward like flames frozen in a single moment. He painted the wheat field below the asylum walls, so many times that each painting is a different kind of seeing. Dawn wheat, noon wheat, wheat in a thunderstorm, wheat with a reaper, the reaper so small against the yellow field that he is almost swallowed by it. And he painted the Starry Night. June 1889, from his window, though the view the painting depicts is almost certainly a composite, assembled from observation and imagination both. The village below is not Arles. The church steeple is not Provençal. It may be a memory of Nouenen. It may be a generalized image of village, home, community, the thing he wanted and could not have. The sky above the village is another matter entirely. It is not the sky as it looks. It is the sky as it feels, turbulent, alive, vast, intimate. The stars are not points of light. They are centers of radiant energy, each one surrounded by halos of blue and gold. The moon, in the upper right, is similarly haloed, a burning crescent that looks less like the moon, and more like the idea of the moon, the emotional truth of what the moon means at night, when you are lying in a bed, in an asylum, that is not your home, and thinking about everyone who is sleeping somewhere else. The dark cypress in the foreground, reaching up from the lower left almost to the top of the canvas, a presence that seems to belong to both the earth and the sky, is the painting's emotional center as much as its compositional anchor. It is alive in a way that trees in paintings are not usually alive. It is straining towards something, whether that something is the stars or simply away from the ground, is left, deliberately, unresolved. Vincent was not pleased with the Starry Night. He wrote to Theo that it was a failure, that he had gone too far into abstraction, had sacrificed accuracy for intensity. He preferred, he wrote, his paintings of the olive trees. He thought the Starry Night was too rhetorical, too much. He was wrong about this one. He was sometimes wrong about his own work. Artists often are. He left Saint-Rémy in May 1890, at Theo's recommendation. Theo had arranged for him to be cared for by a physician in Auvers-sur-Oise, a village north of Paris. The physician was Paul Gachet, an amateur painter himself, a homeopathist, a man who had known several of the Impressionists. He would care for Vincent, keep him stable, monitor his condition. Theo would pay. First, though, Vincent passed through Paris. He spent 3 days with Theo and Theo's wife, Jo, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, whom Theo had married in 1889, and who had given birth to their son in January 1890. The boy had been named Vincent Willem van Gogh, after his uncle. Vincent held his nephew. He walked through Theo's apartment, which was hung with his paintings Theo had kept, stored, believed in, through more than a decade of other people's indifference. He saw, perhaps for the first time, what his work looked like as a body, accumulated, organized, significant. He was moved by it. He also found Paris exhausting. Too much noise, too many people, too much stimulation for a mind that had spent the last year in a controlled environment. He took the train to Auvers after 3 days, relieved to be going. The 70 days Vincent spent in Auvers-sur-Oise are among the most productive in his entire career, which is saying something extraordinary. He produced approximately 75 paintings, 1 a day. In some cases, 2 in a day. He worked with the same driven intensity as Arles, perhaps more so, because something in him knew or felt that the time available was running out. He painted Auvers the way he had painted everything he loved, completely, exhaustively, as though the act of painting it was the only way to fully inhabit it. The village church, with its deep blue sky and the 2 paths leading to it, one of which contains a single solitary woman walking away from us, a figure whose back is to us and always will be. The portrait of Dr. Gachet, who sits at a table, his chin in his hand, with an expression that Vincent described in a letter as the heartbroken expression of our time. He made 2 versions, the one in private hands, sold at auction in 1990 for $82.5 million. At the time, the highest price ever paid for a painting at auction. And the wheat fields, always the wheat fields. The last of them, or what many scholars believe was the last, though the sequence is not certain, is Wheatfield with Crows, a wide format canvas, nearly double the standard proportion. A panoramic rectangle that forces your eye to sweep from side to side, across an expanse of green and gold under a sky that is the darkest, most turbulent blue Vincent ever painted. 3 paths enter the field from the bottom of the canvas and lead nowhere. They do not go through the field. They do not exit at the top. They simply stop. Above the field, the crows, black, scattered, moving in a direction that is not toward the viewer and not away, but sideways, across, into the edge of the canvas and out of it. People have read this painting as a suicide note for 130 years. The dark sky, the dead-end paths, the departing birds. It is not a difficult reading to arrive at. Vincent's last letter to Theo, written on July 23rd and found unsent in his pocket after he was shot, contains a phrase that has been quoted 10,000 times, that he felt a great calm, and that through his work, he was trying to say something consoling, something that was not from the world of the dying. He also said, in the same letter, that he was uncertain what to think, that he could see no way forward, but also no end to what he wanted to paint. On July 27, 1890, Vincent van Gogh walked into the wheat fields above Auvers and shot himself in the chest with a revolver. The wound was not immediately fatal. He walked back to the inn where he was staying. The innkeeper found him in his room. A doctor was summoned, and then Dr. Gachet. They stabilized him, or tried to. Someone sent word to Theo. Theo arrived from Paris the next morning. He sat with his brother through the night. Vincent was conscious. Sometimes they talked. What they said to each other in those final hours was not recorded. Theo wrote to Joe afterward that Vincent had said, near the end, "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. Whether he said this, and whether it means what it seems to mean, has been debated by biographers for generations. What is not debated is that Vincent van Gogh died at 1:30 in the morning on July 29, 1890. He was 37 years old. Theo van Gogh died 6 months later. He was 33 years old. The cause was a combination of syphilis and what his doctors called a hereditary condition, which likely means he also had some form of the neurological or psychiatric condition that had afflicted Vincent. But his family and friends believed, and perhaps they were right, that he had also simply broken, that losing Vincent had taken something from him, that no amount of medical treatment could replace. In 1914, at Theo's widow Jo's request, Theo's body was moved from Utrecht, where he was originally buried, and reinterred in Auvers-sur-Oise. He is buried next to his brother, the two graves, covered in ivy, side by side in the small churchyard above the village, above the wheat fields, are today among the most visited graves in France. Jo van Gogh Bonger, who deserves a great deal more credit than she usually receives, spent the years after Theo's death organizing, cataloging, and systematically promoting Vincent's work. She had inherited, from Theo's estate, the hundreds of paintings and drawings that Vincent had sent to his brother over the years. She also had the letters, Vincent's side of the correspondence, which she edited and published in 1914. The publication of those letters transformed how the world understood Van Gogh, not just as a painter, but as a thinker, a writer, a man of extraordinary intelligence, whose inner life was as remarkable as anything he painted. She arranged exhibitions, she negotiated loans, she placed works in collections, she answered every inquiry. She was, in every meaningful sense, the person who made the Van Gogh we know today, made him visible, made him legible, made him matter to generations of people who would never otherwise have encountered him. And the world, slowly and then all at once, understood what it had. The reputation grew through the first decades of the 20th century. It exploded after the Second World War. The Starry Night came to MoMA in 1941. The sunflowers sold at auction in 1987 for £22 million. Then a world record. Today, the major Van Gogh canvases are insured for figures that make the word valuable seem inadequate. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, built specifically to house his work and opened in 1973, receives nearly 2 million visitors a year. He is, by most measures, the most recognized artist in the world. The man who sold one painting in his lifetime, the man who died in a rented room in a village north of Paris with a bullet wound in his chest, The man his neighbors in Arles petitioned to have removed from their community. The man who was told, repeatedly, by the world around him, that what he was doing was not working and was not wanted. What do you do with this story? The temptation is to make it a parable, the unrecognized genius, the world too blind to see what was in front of it, the tragic artist burning too bright for the age he was born into. It is a clean story. It is satisfying in the way that stories about vindication are always satisfying. It lets us feel that we, if we had been there, would have seen it, would have bought the paintings, would have understood. I'm not sure that is true, and I am not sure the parable is what the story is actually about. Vincent van Gogh was not destroyed by indifference. He was destroyed by illness, by a neurological and psychiatric condition whose exact diagnosis has been debated for a century and remains genuinely uncertain. Epilepsy has been proposed, and bipolar disorder, and Meniere's disease, and acute intermittent porphyria, and schizoaffective disorder, and absinthe poisoning, and a genetic condition called MERRF syndrome, and half a dozen other things. What we know is that from 1888 onward, he experienced acute episodes, periods of profound disorientation, hallucination, self-destructive behavior, separated by periods of clarity, in which he functioned at a level of intellectual and creative brilliance that most healthy people never approach. The relationship between his illness and his art is one of the most discussed questions in the history of Western culture. Did the madness produce the art? Would a healthy Van Gogh have been as great a painter? Would the swirling skies, the haloed stars, the kinetic cypresses have been possible without whatever it was that was happening to his brain? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we should be careful about the inference that suffering is the price of genius, or that great art requires a broken artist. This is a comforting story for people who do not have to live inside the breaking. It is not a story that survives contact with the actual human cost. What we can say is this: Vincent van Gogh made extraordinary paintings. He made them in the intervals between episodes of severe illness. He made them with a speed and intensity that suggests his capacity for focused work, when it was available to him, was almost unimaginable. And he made them while maintaining, in his letters, in his thinking about painting, in his understanding of what art was for, a level of critical intelligence and philosophical sophistication. That puts him in a different category from the mad genius mythology that has been built around him. He knew what he was doing. That is the thing the mythology most consistently erases. He wasn't pouring out emotion unconsciously, driven by forces he couldn't understand or control. He was making choices, conscious, considered, often agonized choices, about color and composition and brushwork and subject matter. He had a theory of painting. He had ideas about what painting was for. He had opinions about other artists' work that were sometimes wrong, and often more insightful than anyone else's. He wrote to Theo about the color theory behind the Night Cafe, a painting of a Arles cafe interior that he described as the clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens, explaining that he wanted to express the terrible passions of humanity through red and green, not just to paint a cafe, to use the visual language of complementary colors, colors that vibrate against each other, that create optical discomfort when placed in proximity, to produce an emotional effect that no amount of figurative accuracy could produce on its own. He wrote about wanting to paint portraits that would be read by people 100 years later. Like an apparition, he wrote about wanting to capture the consoling quality of color, the way a particular combination of yellows and violets could produce something like spiritual comfort in a person who was suffering. He wanted art to do work, real work, the work that religion was supposed to do, but was, for more and more people in the modern world, no longer able to do. This is the ambition behind the paintings. Not to be beautiful, though they are. Not to be technically original, though they are that too. But to be useful. To be, in the specific sense that a word of comfort in a dark moment is useful. Good for something. Whether they achieved this in Vincent's lifetime is a question with a painful answer. They did not reach the people they were made for. The miners of the baronage never saw the potato eaters. The poor families of Nuenen never sat in front of the Arles Café painting and felt the color work on them. The art was made for a world that had not yet figured out how to receive it. But what about now? What about the 2 million people a year who stand in front of his paintings in Amsterdam? What about the hundreds of millions who have reproductions on their walls, who have his paintings on their phones, who feel something specific and real when they look at the swirling sky above Saint-Rémy? Is that the consolation he was looking for? Delivered 100 years late to people he would never meet in a language he invented? Or is the delay itself part of the tragedy? The unbridgeable gap between the need to be consoling and the fact of not being there to know if it worked? I don't have an answer to that. I don't think anyone does. But I think asking the question is important because Vincent asked it too. He asked it in almost every letter he wrote. He asked whether what he was doing was worth doing, whether it was reaching anyone, whether the painting he poured himself into was having any effect on any person anywhere in the world. Theo's answer, every time, was yes. Keep painting. What you are making matters. I believe in it. I believe in you. And then he sent the monthly allowance, which arrived reliably, regardless of whether Vincent had thanked him for the last one, regardless of the chaos of Vincent's life, regardless of the cost to Theo's own ambitions and comfort and savings. For 10 years, he sent the allowance, and he wrote the letters, and he kept the paintings, and he did not stop. The art world talks about Van Gogh's genius constantly. It talks less often about Theo's, but what Theo did, the willingness to sustain, financially and emotionally, a person and a project that the world had decided was worthless, required a kind of faith that is its own form of extraordinary. Not artistic genius, human genius, the genius of not stopping when everyone else has stopped. What remains? 900 paintings, more than 1,100 drawings, more than 800 letters, and something harder to quantify, a way of looking at the world that is seeped into the consciousness of everyone who has ever stood in front of one of his canvases and felt the color do something to them that they did not fully expect. The legacy of Van Gogh is not, primarily, technical. Other painters have had as much influence on the mechanics of how paint is applied. The legacy is perceptual. He changed the way a significant portion of humanity looks at the physical world, at the sky, at trees, at fields of grain, at the light of a cafe at night. He made it possible to see those things, not just as objects with measurable properties, but as presences with emotional character, as things that feel something, or that allow us to feel something through them, that has no other adequate channel of expression. You look at a starry night now, any starry night, any night sky anywhere in the world, and if you know his paintings, even if you don't consciously think of them, you see it slightly differently. You see the stars not as points, but as presences. You feel the scale of the sky not as distance, but as depth. Something in the way he looked at things has become part of how we look at things. He did it with color. He did it with brushwork. He did it by refusing to see the world as neutral, when he knew, with his whole body, that it was not. He also left the letters, and of everything he left, the letters may be the most important for what they actually say about the experience of making art, not as a triumphant genius, not as a tortured saint, as a person who woke up every morning and tried to make something honest out of a life that was often unbearable, who failed much more often than he succeeded, who knew the difference between those two states with a clarity that most people protect themselves from. He wrote to Theo once that he would rather fail at something that mattered than succeed at something that didn't. He wrote it simply, as a statement of fact, as though it were obvious. It wasn't obvious to the world around him. It isn't obvious to most of us, but it is, perhaps, the clearest articulation of what the work was for, what drove him back to the canvas every morning after every failure, every rejection, every episode of illness. That took him away from the work and then gave him back to it. He failed at almost everything the world uses to measure success. He never had money. He never had recognition. He never had the sustained, intimate relationship he spent his life looking for. He never had the studio of the South he dreamed of in Arla, the community of artists working together, sustaining each other, making something collectively that none of them could make alone. But he painted the starry night. He painted the sunflowers. He painted the bedroom in the cafe terrace at night and the almond blossom, and the portrait of Dr. Gachet, and the wheat field with crows, and 200 canvases at Arles, and 80 canvases at Auvers, and the potato eaters, and the sorrow drawing, and 1,000 other things that are now spread across the world in museums and private collections, and reproductions on walls, and the phone screens of people who have no idea they're carrying something made by a man who needed the money for bread. The sadness will last forever, perhaps, but so will the paintings. And the paintings, if they do what Vincent intended them to do, are consoling, not in a small way, not in the way that a pleasant image on a wall is consoling, in the way that being truly seen is consoling, in the way that knowing someone else looked at the same dark sky and found it beautiful, and found the beauty worth communicating, and communicated it with their whole body and their whole life, is consoling. You are not alone in the dark. Someone was here before you. He looked up. He painted what he saw. He left it for you. This has been Art and Ashes. If this story kept you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, which Van Gogh? The Nuenen peasant painter in dark earth tones, the Paris convert who found color, the Arles visionary painting sunflowers for a friend who was about to leave, the asylum patient who looked out a window at the night sky and painted God into it, or the exhausted man in Auvers, who kept painting anyway, feels most real to you tonight? And tell us what story you want next. Every comment gets read, every single one. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.